Hello, History 363. So today I want to actually take a step back from the blow-by-blow narratives we've been having about the course of various Roman wars and campaigns and actually talk a little bit about Roman war motives. Why do the Romans go to war? Why do the Romans go to war as frequently as they do? And here I actually want to bring in sort of the historiography. What do other scholars think about as they debate the causes and the trends behind Roman imperialism? And for the purposes of this course, I've generally tread relatively lightly on bringing in sort of modern scholarly work. I mean, largely what you're getting in both these lectures and also in your textbook is sort of consensus synthesis. When we take the primary sources and sort of the broad consensus of what smart people think about them, that's kind of what your textbook represents. It does occasionally take sides in sort of debates or note that there are certain debates, but it's really sort of trying to provide a kind of authoritative survey of Roman history. And well, my own lectures, sometimes I'll admit, okay, there's some debate or there's some dissent between scholars, but here's what I think. I'll do that occasionally, but I'm also kind of giving you a master narrative. But in reality, one thing that professional historians spend a lot of time doing is simply arguing with one another about how we should interpret history. Now, I want to stress that these arguments do not suggest that history is somehow subjective or that it's all just sort of made up or imaginary. All of the arguments that scholars have are deeply fact-based. The reason that there's scholarly debate and discussion and alternate interpretations oftentimes stems from two different factors. One, scholars simply use different kinds of evidence. So one sort of package of evidence, whether it's an archive, a type of evidence, say, for example, a literary source versus an archaeological source, may simply push the interpretation in a particular direction, whereas another type of evidence might, or another archive or another typology of evidence might push the interpretation in another direction. That's totally fine, right? You're still making arguments using evidence, but you can also talk about how different evidence might lead to different interpretations. Now, for our purposes here, we're actually using all of the scholars, even as they disagree vigorously with one another, would generally concede that we're using the same evidence. Polybius, Livy, Plutarch, Appian. So therefore, the interpretations are simply based on how to take the information in our sources and then necessarily apply it to our sort of our master narrative of Roman history. And again, that does not suggest this is a subjective project. Human history is an extraordinarily multi-variable function. And so, you can look at the same evidence and draw different conclusions about what the heck is going on, and that can be quite reasonable. And indeed, in some ways, one reason that historians spend a lot of time, particularly when they're say doing graduate training, doing historiography, reading past scholarship, is that oftentimes the way that we kind of get the shape of what a problem looks like, maybe what the probability features are, is looking at the different debates, the back and forth of different historians as they sort of poke at each other and prod at each other and challenge each other's arguments. Oftentimes they kind of give us the shape of maybe what the problem is, and that itself is useful, even if that shape is created by different interpretations kind of clashing against one another. So the problem for today is, why do the Romans go to war as frequently as they do during the Middle Republic? This problem, at least for the purposes of its current form, is largely defined by a 1977 book by a Columbia scholar named William B. Harris, who wrote a book called War and Imperialism in Republican Rome. And Harris argued that the Romans were an pathologically bellicose people, essentially that warfare is hardwired in a way, into the Roman, not just psyche, but into the Roman kind of whole sociocultural system. And this made the Romans really much more bellicose compared to other peoples. The Romans are the ones, therefore, always inciting war because it's so deeply in Rome's interest. And Harris did parse the differences between, say, the Roman aristocracy, the nobiles, and the common Romans. So for the Roman aristocracy, Harris argues these guys need constant warfare because of the competitive nature of the Roman aristocracy to maintain, to establish, and then reestablish their political position and their family's political position. The way that you distinguish yourself as a Roman politician when you've reached the consulship is success in warfare. And indeed, the highest honor, really, political honor that you can get is the triumph, that grand procession that maybe only 1 in 3 consuls during the Republic is lucky enough to enjoy. And then that really sets you above even your peers that have reached the consulship. So you need warfare in order to simply maintain your family's political prestige, your family's political capital, and so much of your own self-worth is wrapped up in did you, when you had a chance, fight a successful campaign. And this means that you have the Roman leadership oftentimes only in power for a very short period of time, a year as praetor, a year as consul, maybe a prorogation. They're going to be as aggressive as possible when they have that power, always pushing towards war, always, if engaged in diplomacy, taking the most aggressive stance, because they benefit if things turn kinetic. So that's what Harris argued for the kind of pathologies of the elite. He also noted that there is a huge economic motive behind Roman warfare. The Roman economy is deeply entwined with Rome's ability to basically take other people's stuff. So this includes the elite. Not only do they need warfare for their own political prestige, they also get rich off of warfare. And indeed, as they are able to, through successful military campaigns, exploit larger and larger portions of the Mediterranean, the elite get wealthier and wealthier as they're able to skim off more and more of Rome's wealth, the wealth achieved through conquest. At the same time, remember, these wars are fought by common soldiers, and these wars have to be voted on by the Comitia Centuriata, by the Assembly of Roman people, and they almost always vote yes. And so Harris argues that the Roman people have a deep economic motive behind warfare. Land, particularly in Italy and then also in Cisalpine Gaul, is a major motive during the early and middle republic, since land distribution dramatically benefits the Roman plebs. And also, even as the Romans are operating outside of Italy, where land is therefore less of a motive, loot is an incredibly important source of wealth to common Roman soldiers. Obviously, they get paid, their stipendium, but the fact that they get a cut of loot, or that the loot is sold, particularly slaves, and that may be the source of donatives given to soldiers before a triumph. Remember, if you're a Roman general and you're triumphing, one of the things that people remember is, were your soldiers in a good mood? And did they, even if they sing sort of scurrilous songs about you, did those songs suggest that they actually, deep down, you have a great relationship with your boys? The way you get your soldiers in a good mood is to give them money before the triumphal donative that's derived from the loot you took on campaign. So Roman soldiers, in addition to getting paid, and Roman military pay is pretty modest, are raking in loot from across the Mediterranean. This seems to be a big motive, in part behind Roman military service. If we remember talking about the First Punic War, the Roman people are hesitant to authorize one of the consuls going into Sicily. And the consuls basically, both of them say, hey, look, if this happens, there will likely be a lot of loot. And this sways the Roman people, and they approve the expedition. Therefore, we have economic motives and we have cultural motives, given how the competitive aristocracy needs something to strive for, and that thing to strive for is military success. So Harris, therefore, sees the Roman people as, again, pathologically bellicose. And for him, this explains why the Roman people go to war every single year. And it is true, the Romans are constantly on campaign, even after the Second Punic War, which I think you'd appreciate does represent a kind of existential threat to the Roman state. Even after that, in the 2nd century BC, between 200 and 167, the Romans maintain on average between 8 and 9 legions in the field. That's easily about 50,000 Roman citizens and a greater number of Italians. And that represents a huge proportion of the total citizen population, which again it's recovering, but is around 250,000 according to what our census returns suggest. A massive mobilization, and they keep doing that year in and year out. All of these campaigns authorized by the Senate and a vote by the Roman people. And so there is a case to be made that yes, the Romans are at least habitually bellicose. They choose to be at war year in and year out. The Romans even have a little ceremony. It may be invented around the end of the First Punic War, where when there is no war going on, they close the doors of the Temple of Janus. And then when the war breaks out again, they open the doors again. They only close the doors once after the First Punic War, and they won't be closed again until Octavian Augustus closes them. Perhaps reinventing the ritual, but no one had thought to reinvent the ritual until then because Rome was always at war. So there is, Harris's interpretation was really dominant for much of the 20th and even into the early 21st century. One thing that I think maybe should be worth noting in this post-Me Too world, and may also shed some light on Harris's own interpretations. Harris very publicly was forced to retire from Columbia amid substantiated and well-reported sexual harassment allegations. He had aggressive pathologies of his own. And so I think that may be worth noting, again, not to personally attack him, but that may put his scholarship in some perspective. And also, as I'm talking about people's interpretation, and Harris's book is by itself a good book. But we should also note that scholarly accomplishment or scholarly brilliance is not the only thing that makes you a good person. And that particularly in this moment of reevaluation about sort of gender equity, I think that's important to at least bring up. All right, so that is one interpretation. The Romans are pathologically violent, and why do the Romans go to war? Of course they're going to go to war. Their socioeconomic system is hardwired for warfare, and everyone else is just the unlucky victim of, again, this pathological serial killer that's running amok across the Mediterranean. Now, a bit of pushback, particularly in consideration of Rome's operations in the Greek East, came from Eric Gruen, actually one of my professors at UC Berkeley, who particularly through a 1984 book, The Hellenistic World and the Coming of Rome. And Gruen does not portray Rome as some kind of pathologically bellicose power. Rather, Gruen portrays Rome as a power with an elite, the senatorial elite, that is deeply interested in engaging with the Greek world and engaging with the Greek world on the Greek world's terms. That this is the Romans want to be part of this international system that has its own defined norms, its own defined behaviors, and they in Gruen's terms, find this attractive, and they want to integrate both themselves and also the Roman state into this, again, very legible Hellenistic international system. And some of this, of course, also stems from the fact that many Roman elites deeply admire and want to take part in Greek high culture. So for Gruen, the fact that sometimes Roman engagement in the Greek East leads to war it's somewhat of an unhappy accident, because part of Greek diplomacy isn't just saying fine things and getting along. It oftentimes involves taking a stand against disruptive powers. It involves supporting allies militarily. It involves posturing, threatening warfare as, say, diplomatic negotiations sort of escalate. And sometimes when you threaten warfare, you have to follow through. So For Gruen, the fact that the Romans get involved in the Second Macedonian War or the Third Macedonian War, it oftentimes is part of their broader interest in interjecting themselves into the Greek world, which at times involves military commitment. And for Gruen, it's simply sort of a happenstance, you might say, that the Romans happen to have an extremely effective army that mops the floor with Macedonian and Seleucid armies. Now, again, Gruen was in many ways really pushing back directly against Harris. And I think on one hand, we should note that the Romans are people who spend a lot of time doing diplomacy. You may get 1 year as a command, as a praetor, or 1 year as a consul. But if you're a senator, you spend a lot of your time receiving embassies and engaging in diplomatic discourse. And so it may be important to note that the Romans are actually, diplomacy is actually very important to them. It's something that they have expertise in. They're not simply spending their whole time sort of having bloody fantasies of how to deploy their legions to envelop or flank the enemy. So in this pushback, I think it is useful. Of course, one potential weakness is one might be a little curious as to why the Romans have such an effortlessly good army that does always just sort of dominate military operations in the East. That's something that Gruen doesn't really sort of address other than acknowledge, but that may suggest that there is something going on that is causing them to invest a lot of time, effort, infrastructure in their military operations, which could potentially make them a bit more prone to warfare. Now, perhaps the most recent and also very widely, at this point, widely accepted interpretation, reinterpretation, comes from one of Gruen's students, Arthur Eeckstein, at the University of Maryland. And Eeckstein became interested in international relations theory. So he's actually very theorized, and the theory comes from studying modern international relations. Why do modern states go to war? And the theory that he's most interested in is usually referred to as IR realism. Realism being it seeks to explain how states behave based on their relative power. The idea that states, care about power, are pretty good at sizing each other up, although sometimes with friction and uncertainty, and that those power differentials largely drive the conduct of states and whether states choose to go to war with one another. Now, a key theme of IR realism is that absent systems of international jurisdiction, which are, although under strain, quite common in our world, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, huge numbers of international agencies that even with sovereign states oftentimes serve to settle disputes and reduce the chances of conduct. Those don't exist in the ancient world. For IR theory, a system like the ancient Mediterranean is a system of anarchy, where it's really every state for itself. And indeed, Eckstein's 2005 book is entitled Mediterranean Anarchy, where the strong, and in Thucydides' words, of course, Thucydides is oftentimes seen as a kind of intellectual forefather for IR realism. The strong do what they will, and the weak do what they must. The weak suffer what they must. For Eckstein, on one hand, he sort of agreed with Harris. He said, look, the Romans have an incredibly bellicose structure, and warfare is hardwired into their culture and society and their economy. But Eckstein said where Harris erred is he thought Rome was exceptional in this regards, that Rome is the only truly bellicose power, and everyone else is just kind of these hapless, luckless victims. Eckstein said, no. Rome is one bellicose power in an anarchic environment full of bellicose powers. Because if you are not a bellicose power in an anarchic environment where the strong, do what they can, you won't survive. It's Darwinian. You could develop a wonderful, peace-loving culture, and you'll just get overrun by a more aggressive neighbor. So bellicosity is therefore a common solution. And indeed, Eckstein argued, he said, look, the Romans were bellicose, as Harris conveniently points out, usefully points out for us. But so were the Carthaginians, so were the Hellenistic kingdoms, so were the Athenians and the Spartans, particularly in the 5th and 4th centuries. Everyone is bellicose, and therefore we shouldn't necessarily see Rome as an exceptionally bellicose power. It's just par for the course. So therefore, now admittedly, Eckstein did acknowledge that in anarchy, states can oftentimes be somewhat paranoid because threats can be real and existential, and therefore they may also act violently and preemptively. Now, Eckstein also, and we'll talk about this a little more when we look into the Second Macedonian War, probably on Friday. For Eckstein, a key event that marked Rome's entry into the Greek East was a pact between the kings, a pact between Macedonia and the Seleucid Empire to annex the territories and resources of Ptolemaic Egypt, a state that's undergoing a bad dynastic transition. And so for Eckstein, he said, look, in a realist world, the Romans have reason to be suspicious against other powers. They've just suffered a terrible war against Hannibal, a reminder of the existential threats that one power can pose to another. And when they hear that two powers in the East are planning to gobble up a third, which will radically shift the balance of power and create two sort of superpowers in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Romans respond with military intervention, initially against Macedonia and then subsequently against the Seleucid Empire. So here we have an explanation, and he fleshes this out in the second book, Rome Enters the Greek East. So here Eckstein suggests, look, the Romans are bellicose, but they also live in a dangerous environment where there is a lot of paranoia and little trust and a legitimate fear of rival powers, and that explains why the Romans frequently choose to initiate wars, in part as a matter of self-defense. And maybe not just self-defense in a narrow sense, but in sort of a broader self-defense. The only way to survive is to constantly reassert yourself as the strongest power. Anyway, those are three views, and of course, those aren't the only scholars who have contributed to this problem, which is it's one of those embarrassment of riches, a question which so many people have written intelligently on. But I think those three scholars sort of create a shape to the debate. Should we look at Roman bellicosity? Should we look at other forms of Roman engagement, particularly diplomatic engagement, as perhaps driving Roman contact with Greek entities in a way that isn't as malign as we just want to smash them up and take their stuff? Or Eckstein suggesting, are the Romans responding perhaps rationally to an extremely dangerous international environment which they find themselves in? And indeed, in 201, it takes very little to convince the Romans that their state could be destroyed by another powerful state. They almost were by Hannibal and Carthage. Now, like I say, it's unclear to me that any one of these scholars is right or wrong, but again, I do think it's useful thinking about their contributions as in shaping the problem of why does Rome go to war, what motives on the Roman side undergird Roman imperialism. All right, next time we will talk about Rome's actual entry into the Greek East, a few preludes, the Illyrian Wars, and then the Second Macedonian War in 200 BC. I'll see you then.